truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Tuesday, August 27th, 2024, the 1,315th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and a hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at I'mYourModerator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month, and in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so we're going to get started by updating some of the things we talked about yesterday, and one of them, to be honest, I failed you. I had this Robert F. Kennedy Jr. post from the weekend right in the mix. It was going to close out that whole RFK Jr. section. And I realized after I put the show up that I totally blew it. I forgot to add this very important part. We talked yesterday about some of the blowback that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is receiving and will continue to receive by people who would have, under other circumstances, pretended to be his very best friend. And that, of course, includes many family members. I've had this experience myself. I imagine that many of you have had this experience. People you thought you would be close to throughout your life into old age suddenly are no longer in your life because you exercised your right to voice your opinion in public about important matters the same way that they do. You just happen not to agree with them. You have the opposite point of view. So while they're saving the planet from climate change and solving racism and preventing Russia from taking over the world, you're the one causing climate change, and you're the racist, and you are a Russian propaganda asset. They're sure that all of it is true, even though they don't know why, and they're not going to talk about it because they don't want you to have a platform, even just one-on-one with them, whereby you might convince other people that your beliefs are true and then further harm the planet, create more racism, and allow Putin to steamroll his tanks through Europe. This, of course, is a product of persistent brainwashing and conditioning, and it's very sad. But this is where we are in 2024. Hopefully, they will get out of that mindset, and maybe someone like RFK Jr. crossing over will help them to do that. There is no doubt in my mind that that is what he is primarily involved for. Sure, he has his pet issues that he cares very deeply about and that he's been working on his entire life, and this move might allow him to achieve success along all those lines with the backing of not only the American president, but also the American people. But the most important impact RFK Jr. might have is that he's able, in some sense, to bridge that divide. And I think the statement he put out over the weekend is a perfect example of that. I think it's really a wonderful statement. He put this up on X, formerly Twitter, on Sunday morning before most people were even awake. What MAGA really means. The phrase has troubled liberals who think it's a call for a return to an America before civil rights, gay rights, and women's rights. But I have a more generous interpretation, one that is truer to my experience of Donald Trump as he is today. Make America Great Again recalls a nation brimming with vitality, with a can-do spirit, with hope and a belief in itself. It was an America that was beginning to confront its darker shadows, could acknowledge the injustice in its past and present, yet at the same time could celebrate its successes. It was a nation of broad prosperity, the world's most vibrant middle class, and an idealistic belief, though not consistently applied, in freedom, justice, and democracy. It was a nation that led the world in innovation, productivity, and technology. And it was the healthiest country in the world. I have talked to many Trump supporters. I have talked with his inner circle. I have talked to the man himself. This is the America they want to restore. And yes, I think that that is an appropriate and positive message, one that can be unifying. And while in my view, he doesn't encapsulate everything that MAGA means, he does say to a large number of people who are coming out of their Trump derangement that actually neither the man nor his supporters are trying to hurt or oppress anybody. They're not after power. They're not after wealth or status. They genuinely just want to make America great again. And while that certainly means different things to different people, what we're facing is a movement that's explicitly committed to making America not America. If America means anything, it means adherence to that founding mythology, however true or false that was, and adherence to the Bill of Rights, most particularly freedom of speech, and we're going to spend some time on that today. But if your purpose as a government and as a political movement is to implement the agenda selected by global governing bodies on behalf of a fiat banking regime that has controlled the world for centuries, and you are actively trying to do away with our borders, then you can't claim to be involved in some patriotic effort to create a strong America that looks out for all its people. What they're really doing is looking to cast off America's sovereignty completely. And as the sovereignty of the nation goes away, so goes the sovereignty of the individual. But of course, they don't care about individual sovereignty either. And again, that's one of the foundational values of Americanism in the first place. And I don't think an argument needs to be made at length along those lines. Just look at the COVID tyranny and where all those plans were headed in the future, and I think you can get all the way there. Now, none of this should need to be said. It's all a product of a grand psychological manipulation, and unfortunately, we're being drawn out of it with a grand psychological manipulation, but maybe that is in fact what's required. We should just be mindful of that fact, because at some point that grand psychological manipulation has to end, having achieved its goals fully or partially, and then it needs to stop. Otherwise, we've just moved from one version of that psychological manipulation to the other. And as far as I'm concerned, that is, let's say, less than ideal. Now, in some sense, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with Donald Trump is striving to unite two opposing sides, or at least two sides that were in opposition according to the controlled opposition dynamic as it has always been presented to us, as it's been drilled into our heads and conditioned over our entire lifetimes. But that, of course, is an aspect of the false reality. In reality, this is just two groups of people who agree about nearly everything coming back together with the understanding that their differences were in some way superficial and thrust upon them based on that conditioning and manipulation. Normal people who just want to be good people and have nice lives and succeed to whatever definition of success they might have, and work hard and raise families and have friends and enjoy this life while they have it, are beginning to understand that they've actually just been mimicking the conflict and division that they see playing out on the television and in the newspapers and on social media, or however you get your version of television, and that the people they're mimicking are actually all on the same side in presenting and portraying this controlled opposition dynamic to the public as though it's real. We've talked many times about how so many of these events, these false flag events, they're not entirely real. They're planned out. So they're not spontaneous and they're not organic. But that doesn't mean that real, spontaneous, organic elements don't add themselves onto the event in the process. People are divided over important issues in very superficial ways. And those superficial ways form that controlled opposition dynamic so that neither side ever actually focuses on the real important aspects of these actually important issues. They get lost in the superficiality. And that superficiality, of course, is displayed to them by people who benefit from the selling of that controlled opposition dynamic and how it allows those in control to amass more wealth, status, and power. But people are realizing that their priorities are not our priorities, and it does us no good to mimic their superficial conflicts, and in doing so, help their controllers amass more wealth, status, and power. We can simply opt out of that. And once we opt out of involving ourselves in those superficial conflicts, it gradually becomes apparent to everyone that the conflicts are superficial and that the people displaying these conflicts are wittingly or unwittingly part of the trick. They are in on it. It eventually becomes clear that the sides are the people and those displaying this superficial conflict and their controllers. And so for the people, while they realize that they're not actually divided in the ways they thought they were, they are able to heal and bond and come back together. But amusingly, the same holds true for the people displaying the superficial conflict and those controlling them. They begin to coalesce. They come together, understanding that their dramatic displays of superficial conflict are no longer convincing anyone. And so that becomes a wasted effort that is better reapplied to them coming together and bringing to bear whatever force they can muster to remain collectively in power. We are seeing the Uniparty right and the Uniparty left come back together as we are seeing the quote-unquote two sides of the people coming back together, having realized that the conflicts were largely superficial, or certainly not what we should be focused on at a time like this. Now, we've been discussing aspects of this dynamic for 2 years on this show. And over the course of that time, we have watched the Uniparty reveal itself. Sure, its members will still pretend online that it is some kind of conspiracy theory, but those are the people who are probably involved unwittingly. They're the true believers who really think that Donald Trump is a threat to the country and not just a threat to the Uniparty. They think they've been working on very important projects all these years. They think they've been doing their best to stave off this encroaching dystopia while supporting the party establishments at the behest of corporations for the benefit of that global regime as they help it to implement its agenda in the United States as it's being implemented across the world. They don't think the Uniparty can exist because they're part of it. And while they might continue to deny its existence so they don't have to admit it, so they don't have to talk about it, so that it won't become real to them, they continue to put it on display more and more, and they brag about how important it is that they're doing it. We saw Democrats brag at the DNC about how they'd landed former Melania Trump assistant Stephanie Grisham and former Mike Pence advisor on the coronavirus task force Olivia Troy, and former Republican representative, Trump impeachment hoaxer, and J6 hoaxer Adam Kinzinger all speak at Kamala Harris's convention. Kamala Harris, the most liberal U.S. senator, the most poorly rated fake vice president in history, and a woman who is explicitly signed on to every brand of economic and cultural Marxism on offer from the global regime. Now, in the false reality, the people setting up these stunts believe that these sorts of displays will prove to the country at large that Donald Trump is such a grave threat that even lifelong Republicans, quote unquote, believe it's a matter of conscience to oppose Donald Trump, and they will even put their political differences with Comrade Kamala Harris aside and endorse Democrats, their sworn enemies within the controlled opposition dynamic, because that's what their American values demand. And for a long time, that argument, that display was convincing. It's no longer convincing. All they're showing people is that these three people and others like them will represent any political values necessary to keep themselves in prominent positions and the agenda moving forward because of the incentive and punishment structure, both in reality and, of course, in the party of false decorum, where they are relatively prominent members who believe that they are too far in to ever find their way out. Now, I think the realization of the Uniparty by the American people is one of the most important political developments, certainly in my lifetime, maybe ever. And I am also a fan of acceleration because I believe that people are ready to understand the truth, and I'm a proponent of showing it to them. All of it, rather than assigning myself the responsibility of determining what people are ready to see and what constitutes the sorts of truth worth telling them. And of course, that's its own discussion, but the point here is that any time the Uniparty is willing to show itself in its full glory is a moment I'm going to be happy about. It's funny because in my former life, I focused a lot on branding nightlife venues, bars, and restaurants, helping my friends with branding, whether it was their personal branding or part of a product or business they were involved with. And then I was in a company where we did the same thing, managing celebrities and brands in the social media space. And of course, there are language aspects and visual aspects, but the whole thing altogether is basically a PR campaign. You are marketing a certain image to the world, and then you are also responsive to the feedback, and it works back and forth constantly. I am amazed at this point because the Democrat Party brand is probably one of the worst brands in the country. You have to be basically deranged right now to hear Democrat Party and think good things. And this, by the way, is not some major compliment to Republicans because they're probably not too far behind. At least the Republican brand has Donald Trump next to it and is progressing in the right direction. But prior to Donald Trump, the Republican brand was even worse than the Democrat brand. What we have happening in reality is normal people moving away from that Democrat brand, and many moving away from the Republican brand as well, but moving primarily away from that Democrat brand as fast as possible. And in the face of that, we have people who imagine themselves as elites, as our betters, people who are obviously in positions of power, some in positions of public trust, moving as fast as they can to align themselves with the Democrat brand, thinking that somehow their totally inauthentic display of seriousness and responsibility is not only going to burnish their brand personally, but also help restore the brand of the Republican Party so that we can have some proper controlled opposition in this country once again. Now, what can explain this? Maybe they're in their echo chambers. That's entirely possible. The intellectual kids table problem on Twitter or whatever social media apps they're on that are somehow even dumber than Twitter. Maybe they somehow don't realize how bad things really are. Or maybe they're just totally desperate with nowhere else to turn. But we're talking about people who have essentially been identified as the problem, and having failed in their undercover mission, now that their cover's been blown, they're just declaring their allegiance to the system that everyone understands is the biggest problem. This was yesterday in USA Today. More than 200 Bush, McCain, Romney alums endorse Harris for president, criticize Trump. The letter from alums of the three Republican presidential nominees prior to former President Donald Trump comes on the heels of a Democrat National Convention last week in Chicago that showcased Republican detractors of the GOP nominee. At least 5 former aides to former President George H.W. Bush also signed the letter, which has 238 signatures in all. A similar group of about 150 anti-Trump former staffers of Bush, McCain, and Romney pledged support for President Joe Biden in the 2020 election. So you see that? Kamala Harris, even more popular among rhinos. That's amazing. We reunite today, joined by new George H.W. Bush alumni, to reinforce our 2020 statements and, for the first time, jointly declare that we're voting for Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz this November, the letter reads. Of course, we have plenty of honest, ideological disagreements with Vice President Harris and Governor Walz. That's to be expected. The alternative, however, is simply untenable. Oh, wow. 238 people are going to vote in a fake election. Is there anyone in the world who cares about the opinions of any of these people? Now, you might think, well, probably they're close friends and relatives. And I guess the answer to that is maybe. But by this point, you gotta think probably not. People have their own ideas about this stuff. Either you're awake or you're not awake. The funny thing is that even the people who organized this letter don't care about the opinions of the people who signed the letter. The purpose of this is to create headlines. Maybe they thought that they would get TV appearances and make their convincing case on the air, but all this project amounts to is one headline for one day with one number that they wanted to make as big as possible. 238, you know what's better than that? 239 or 240. And if you fit the minimum standard of having worked for one of these prominent Uniparty right cuckolds with an R next to his name, then you can be part of their number too. It's a very exclusive club. Let's find out who's in it. Among those who signed the letter in support of Harris and her running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, include former McCain Chiefs of Staff Mark Salter and Chris Koch, Joe Donahue, former legislative director for McCain, Jennifer Lux, press secretary for McCain's 2008 campaign, and Gene Becker, longtime chief of staff for George H.W. Bush. Also backing Harris are David Nierenberg, Romney's 2012 campaign finance chair, David Garman, Under Secretary of Energy for George W. Bush, and Olivia Troy, a former advisor to both George W. Bush and Vice President Mike Pence. Troy spoke from the stage at the DNC convention last week. Others who signed the letter include Reed Galen, McCain's deputy campaign manager and co-founder of the Lincoln Project, Jim Swift, a former Republican operative who is now senior editor of The Bulwark, an anti-Trump news and opinion site, and former McCain campaign strategist Mike Murphy. What a roster of very serious people that virtually no one has ever heard of. The Lincoln Project and The Bulwark? What star power. Here's what those 238 regime hacks who conveniently added themselves to a list of people who should probably be tried for treason had to say. 4 years ago, President George W. Bush, the late Senator John McCain, and then Governor Mitt Romney alumni came together to warn fellow Republicans that re-electing President Trump would be a disaster for our nation. In those declarations, we stated the plain truth, each predicting that another 4 years of a Trump presidency would irreparably damage our beloved democracy. We made those announcements months before lies about a stolen election became everyday talking points, and 6 months before Trump incited an insurrection, cheering on a mob of sore losers and sycophants as they tried to use force to overturn the will of the American public. We reunite today, joined by new George H.W. Bush alumni, to reinforce our 2020 statements and, for the first time, jointly declare that we're voting for Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz this November. Of course, we have plenty of honest ideological disagreements with Vice President Harris and Governor Walz. That's to be expected. The alternative, however, is simply untenable. And I love how they put that out there, like they are the real representatives of the sentiment we just described in Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s statement about what MAGA really is. They're claiming to put their important differences aside for the good of the nation, but all they're doing is pressing pause on the constant nonsensical display of their superficial differences. Of course, for the good of themselves. At home, another 4 years of Donald Trump's chaotic leadership, this time focused on advancing the dangerous goals of Project 2025. Will hurt real, everyday people and weaken our sacred institutions. It's weird, isn't it, that people whose entire lives are defined by their never-ending groveling for power consider their institutions sacred. Oh, no, wait, that's not weird. That's the most obvious and natural possible conclusion to reach about these sorts of people. They replaced God with the state. They replaced the condition of their immortal soul with supplicating themselves before evil and incompetent worldly powers in hopes of accumulating more treats. The idea that any of these people give a damn about everyday people is preposterous. They don't know any everyday people. They view people in the aggregate. That is what everyday people means to them. The people who are not us and will never get to be us. Those are the everyday people. And they hope to improve the condition of those everyday people also in the aggregate and on whatever basis they determine, using whatever metrics make them look like they're successful. They wanted to force everyone to inject themselves with a toxic experimental substance that couldn't protect them from a disease that couldn't kill them, because according to numbers they made up, there was a very low likelihood that it would be a problem. These people are insane. It is a total inversion within the false reality. But let's continue with their letter. It's not very long. Abroad, democratic movements will be irreparably jeopardized as Trump and his acolyte J.D. Vance kowtow to dictators like Vladimir Putin while turning their backs on our allies. We can't let that happen. And you got to love how much they care about democracy, even though they don't care about legitimate elections at all. And I forgot to mention Project 2025, the agenda that Donald Trump has disavowed. They've set that thing up like some scarecrow. Project 2025 isn't scary. It's also not Trump's policy. They think they've found this perfect boogeyman. Maybe they have within their echo chamber, but I can't imagine that's actually working. In a bit, I hope we'll get to talk about some of those democratic movements that have been irreparably jeopardized. We now know, thanks to exit polling and voter data, that it was moderate Republicans and conservative independents in key swing states that ultimately delivered the presidency to Joe Biden. Honest, hardworking Americans in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and beyond that put country far before party. That's right, everybody. It was the quote-unquote centrist members of the Uniparty right who crossed over for Joe Biden, and that's how he got 81 million real lawful American votes. It wasn't massive, widespread election fraud. It was the courage of Liz Cheney, Bill Kristol, and Jonah Goldberg. The letter ends this way. We are heartfully calling on these friends, colleagues, neighbors, and family members to take a brave stand once more, to vote for leaders that will strive for consensus, not chaos, that will work to unite, not divide, that will make our country and our children proud. Those leaders are Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz. And I bet they said that about the fake President Joe Biden. And then just a couple years later, he was giving a speech in Philadelphia in front of dark red lighting with his fists shaking in the air, screaming about MAGA extremists. And that's when we all knew that the country had been reunited. It really is hilarious that they're citing exit polling and voter data, showing that it was groveling members of the Uniparty right who won Joe Biden the election. It's weird that it took almost 4 years for them to release that special secret data, showing them that this preposterous impossibility was actually the decisive factor. The GOP establishment, the political progeny of George W. Bush, John McCain, and Mitt Romney, saved the country from Donald Trump. Don't you feel how much better your life is as a result of the courage expressed in the actions of these very, very serious people? Now, what does it mean that all of these people have stayed in contact? They're still in similar social circles. They are still politically activated on some level. Mitt Romney's campaign was in 2012. Who have these people been serving since then? They've all kept the little R's next to their names, presumably, and yet they say they're going to cast their vote and convince other people to vote for the most liberal Democrat senator and the lowest rated fake vice president of all time. A woman who won no primaries, won no delegates in 2 election cycles now, and they're providing cover in case the people they work for decide to steal another election on Kamala Harris's behalf. These people are doing a favor for the regime, for their masters, and they expect to be rewarded when Kamala is placed illegitimately in power. What should we expect that they've been doing for these last 12 years and truthfully much longer? Their opposition to the movement represented by Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and Barack Obama is purely superficial. It is purely academic to the extent there is any disagreement at all. They pursue the same broader agenda on behalf of the same people, generally speaking. There is only the Uniparty. People are familiar with the adage, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he did not exist. So what does it mean now that he's just showing himself? The greatest thing the Uniparty ever did was convince the world that they did exist. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And of course, this is not the first time in history when this has happened. The regime reveals itself in one last panicked, desperate gasp, and then it needs to move to a new place and find a new way to hide. And it's only a matter of how much destruction it's able to cause before that process begins. Switching subjects without a segue, we talked about Telegram yesterday and the arrest in France of Telegram's founder, Pavel Durov. My pal G Money has been following Durov for a long time, and he posted on his Telegram channel, Bullion, Bitcoin, and Bullshit, everything they do just backfires on them, eh? After Durov's arrest, Telegram rose from 18th to 8th place in the ranking of the best apps in the United States. In France, Telegram rose to first place in the social networks category in the App Store and became the third most popular app in France. In addition, Telegram took second place in the ranking of social networks in the U.S., and right now it's at number 3. The arrest of Pavel Durov, the CEO of Telegram in France, has had a noticeable impact on the app's visibility and download numbers, as reflected in the App Store rankings. In the U.S., Telegram experienced a significant boost in its app ranking, moving from the 18th position to the 8th in the overall best apps category, excluding games. This represents its highest ranking in the U.S. since at least January 1st, 2023. Additionally, Telegram climbed to the second spot in the social networking category, indicating a surge in interest or downloads, possibly driven by the publicity around Durov's arrest. In France, where Durov was detained, Telegram saw an even more profound effect. It jumped to the top spot in the social networking category on the App Store and became the third most downloaded app overall. This reaction could be attributed to a mix of curiosity, support for Durov's stance on privacy and free speech, or simply increased visibility due to media coverage. So we shall see if Durov is released as planned sometime tomorrow. We will keep an eye on how that case develops. I still expect that we will see this in the future to be a marketing campaign on how Telegram is really bad and it absolutely must be censored in the United States. We'll see if there's a push for that sometime between now and whenever we see the cessation of the Uniparty's death throes in the United States at some point, I think, within the next 6 months, as Donald Trump becomes once again publicly recognized as the president of the United States of America. And not to go too far off track, but I saw again earlier today a letter from July 14th from Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the state of Palestine, to Donald Trump. In the aftermath of the assassination event, Abbas was sending his best wishes to Donald Trump. What caught my eye was that the letter is addressed to H.E. Mr. Donald Trump, former president of the United States, Republican Party's presumptive nominee in the 2024 presidential election. He really put it all on there. But H.E. that means His Excellency. And he begins the letter, Your Excellency. It's strange, isn't it? How all the real world leaders, the ones not controlled by the global regime, the ones who don't run its little colonies as puppet presidents and prime ministers, they all give the utmost respect to Donald Trump. He called him Your Excellency. That's quite the honorific. So Donald Trump is recognized as the leader of the United States of America by world leaders who are not controlled by the global regime. And he's seen as the leader of this country by most of his supporters, though unfortunately many of them did side with the television when it told them Joe Biden actually won the election. But at some point, it won't just be us recognizing Donald Trump as the duly elected president of the United States of America. And it won't just be that group of foreign leaders participating in the multipolar world as it emerges, moving themselves and their country's interests away from that global regime. It'll eventually just be something that everyone understands. And maybe we have to have another fake election. Maybe we have to get the hose again. Maybe we have to see the Uniparty come together in the next illegitimate Congress and attempt to disqualify Donald Trump from becoming president. It depends on how desperate they get and what they think they might be able to pull off. But at some point, that realization will be unavoidable. Until then, they're going to press for censorship in any way they can. They've done it before. We should assume they will try it again. And speaking of them doing it before, Mark Zuckerberg, of all people, released a letter yesterday expressing his regret for censoring Americans on behalf of the quote-unquote Biden-Harris administration, but really on behalf of the Uniparty and on behalf of the global regime. He wrote this letter to Jim Jordan, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the illegitimate House of Representatives. They basically just act as a middleman for information disclosure at this point. They're basically just a canvas on which limited hangouts are painted. But let's have a listen to what Mark Zuckerberg has to say. Chairman Jordan, I appreciate the committee's interest in content moderation on online platforms. As you are aware, Meta has produced thousands of documents as part of your investigation and made a dozen employees available for transcribed interviews. Further, to our cooperation with your investigation, I welcome the opportunity to share what I've taken away from this process. There's a lot of talk right now about how the U.S. government interacts with companies like Meta, and I want to be clear about our position. Our platforms are for everyone. We're about promoting speech and helping people connect in a safe and secure way. As part of this, we regularly hear from governments around the world and others with various concerns around public discourse and public safety. In 2021, senior officials from the Biden administration, including the White House, repeatedly pressured our teams for months to censor certain COVID-19 content, including humor and satire, and expressed a lot of frustration with our teams when we didn't agree. Ultimately, it was our decision whether or not to take the content down, and we own our decisions, including COVID-19 related changes we made to our enforcement in the wake of this pressure. I believe the government pressure was wrong, and I regret that we were not more outspoken about it. I also think we made some choices that, with the benefit of hindsight and new information, we wouldn't make today. Like I said to our teams at the time, I feel strongly that we should not compromise our content standards due to pressure from any administration in either direction, and we're ready to push back if something like this happens again. Oh man, thank goodness. I guess these kind words make up for it. In a separate situation, the FBI warned us about a potential Russian disinformation operation about the Biden family and Burisma in the lead up to the 2020 election. That fall, when we saw a New York Post story reporting on corruption allegations involving then Democrat presidential nominee Joe Biden's family, we sent that story to fact checkers for review and temporarily demoted it while waiting for a reply. It's since been made clear that the reporting was not Russian disinformation, and in retrospect, we shouldn't have demoted the story. We've changed our policies and processes to make sure this doesn't happen again. For instance, we no longer temporarily demote things in the United States while we wait for fact checkers. Well, I guess that's an improvement. Why not realize that fact checkers aren't actually doing the job they claim to be doing, and that they don't have any special access to facts? And regardless of whether or not they have special access to quote unquote facts, you're just not allowed to censor people on behalf of the government. And you shouldn't be censoring people at all. Again, the intellectual kids table problem isn't only a problem of government censorship, it's a problem of all censorship. Censorship doesn't just prevent the censored from speaking, it also prevents everyone else in that information environment from knowing what the censored person has said, which means entire viewpoints are barred from the conversation, even if they are right, even if they are so right that they could correct the false notions held up as truth among those in that echo chamber gathered around the intellectual kids table. Let's go on with Zuck's letter. Apart from content moderation, I want to address the contributions I made during the last presidential cycle to support electoral infrastructure. The idea here was to make sure local election jurisdictions across the country had the resources they needed to help people vote safely during a global pandemic. I made these contributions through the Zuckerberg Initiative. They were designed to be nonpartisan, spread across urban, rural, and suburban communities. Still, despite the analyses I've seen showing otherwise, I know that some people believe this work benefited one party over the other. My goal is to be neutral and not play a role one way or another, or even to appear to be playing a role. So I don't plan on making a similar contribution this cycle. Respectfully, Mark Zuckerberg. Yeah, well, he was barred from making contributions this cycle, and so the Democrats brought up legislation to replace Zuckerbucks with Biden bucks and still carry out the same program. And we've talked many times over the years about this operation at large what that money was used for, how it was deployed by former Obama hack David Plouffe, who we'll get back to in just a second. They set up drop boxes. They paid for election judges. They paid off local officials to implement their election programs and show them results. And they had clawback provisions in the contracts. So if those local officials didn't get the job done, the Chan Zuckerberg initiative could pull back all of the money they had already put in that would surely be already spent. And so where would that money come from? Now, there's also a bit of sleight of hand in the way Zuckerberg describes this and in the way the media has described it over the years. He talks about it being nonpartisan. He talks about it going to urban, suburban, and rural communities. And so when you buy into the controlled opposition dynamic, when you focus on the red and blue factor, the claim can be made that money is going to red areas just like it's going to blue areas. Not that it was equal. It was nowhere close to equal. But I'm suggesting that even the premise itself of serving, quote unquote, both sides makes no sense. It's not somehow neutral to help the Uniparty install the election fraud apparatus in places that can be called red areas, as though all the money was really allotted just to help them actually run elections, and it wasn't allotted to achieve certain results. These weren't adjustments in the direction of election integrity and security. They were the exact opposite. So it's not nonpartisan to claim that you have also put money into the quote unquote red areas. The money going into those red areas will be used to compromise their elections on behalf of the Uniparty just the same as they are in the blue areas. The point is to compromise the elections for the benefit of the Uniparty. Now, that said, you got to at least leave some possibility that Mark Zuckerberg is part of this grand sting that many people at this point believe is happening. But barring that, the surface interpretation here is that Mark Zuckerberg sees which way the wind's blowing, and he's trying to create some distance between himself and the fact that Facebook Meta participated in the rampant and widespread violation of Americans' First Amendment rights that resulted not only in untold deaths and the usurpation of the United States of America, but also in countless horrific effects felt and experienced at a very personal level for the people of this country. People were censored and banned from these platforms at the behest of the government and at the choice of Facebook, causing them to lose friends and family members and their standing in the community. People were defamed. Their reputations and their work prospects were destroyed. It was an absolutely callous violation of human rights on a massive scale. And you can't just come out 3 and 4 years later and say, hey, we're kind of sorry about some of that stuff. Elon Musk posted on his social media platform that did the same thing and still does the same thing. Sounds like a First Amendment violation. And it is a First Amendment violation. It's good that someone like Elon Musk is finally admitting to that. Was it a First Amendment violation when Twitter did it? Now, Elon Musk wasn't there for at least part of that, but the answer's gotta be yes. I wonder what happened to Donald Trump's class action lawsuits against the social media companies. I wonder if we're going to hear about those again in the near future. Guilt has now been admitted by the owner of the most popular social media platforms, so it's hard to imagine a whole lot else is needed in order to get the process started of making the American people whole. I remember signing on to Donald Trump's class action lawsuits against the social media companies, and then I never heard about them again, which was a little unfortunate, but we've had to find a way to be patient during this interminable holding pattern, though it seems like that patience may soon begin to pay off. Trump had a few things to say about this on Truth Social. He wrote, "This is what everyone's been waiting for. The 2020 presidential election was rigged." And of course, that's not news to anyone, nor is the factual basis for the claim about election rigging due to the social media companies censoring the Hunter Biden laptop story and discussion of that story. That is among the least important ways that the election was rigged in terms of actual effect. And while it's very important in principle, they're not going to censor another Hunter Biden laptop story. So imagining this issue, this election interference tactic as being solved and thinking, therefore, we're more likely to get a legitimate election is absurd. The same thing is true of the Robert Epstein Google stuff and how the manipulation of search features on Google is a major part of the election rigging process. It's not that it's not true. It's not that it had no effect. It's just that you could fix both of those problems and the elections would still remain absolutely rigged, irredeemably broken, and wholly unable to produce a legitimate outcome. There was a story yesterday about Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, announcing that over 1 million ineligible voters were removed from Texas voter rolls. And in their press release, they said that 1 million included over 6,500 non-citizens, over 6,000 voters who have a felony conviction, over 457,000 deceased people, over 463,000 voters on the suspense list, over 134,000 voters who responded to an address confirmation notice that they had moved, over 65,000 voters who failed to respond to a notice of examination, over 19,000 voters who requested to cancel their registration. Now, people are excited about this. They're like, oh, that's a big win. And again, as always, I don't mean to belittle the efforts of election integrity people who are working really hard to expose this problem and do what they can to rectify it. I think their work has been really important in exposing the apparatus for what it is, and I've referred to their work countless times. And ultimately, this is good and helpful, I guess, but this does absolutely nothing to make Texas's elections legitimate. It might make the steal more complicated in Texas, but it doesn't by itself fix Texas's elections and create legitimacy where there formerly was none. It's certainly not something that the governor of the state should be bragging about. This is a bare minimum baseline. The fact that there were ever 1 million ineligible voters on the voter rolls in Texas should have people thrown in prison. It should obviously be the fiduciary duty of anyone in office who has anything to do with this issue to make sure that nothing like that ever happened. But of course it did, and now they want credit for meeting a bare minimum standard of acceptable public service. And not only do they want credit for it, they want to use it as PR and advertising to suggest that elections in Texas have been fixed. You want to know how the Uniparty is going to fill up all the down ballot positions in the federal government, the state governments, and local governments? This is how they're going to do it. They're going to meet baseline, bare minimum standards, brag about them, use that as PR for the legitimacy of their elections, and convince otherwise would-be concerned voters, in quotes, that while elections in the country might have their problems, elections where you are just fine. So somebody else is going to have to fix that problem. That's one of the major concerns over the last 4 years. I talk to people who are pretty awake, and they say, well, elections in my state aren't a problem. Elections in Alabama aren't a problem. Elections in Tennessee aren't a problem. Elections in Idaho, they're not a problem. Really? Well, then how are things so messed up in different parts of all those states? How can their elections be just fine when they're using the exact same systems as other states whose elections are obviously stolen in broad daylight? And the answer is because people are focused on the red, blue, Republican, Democrat, left-right dynamic and not on the underlying reality or the underlying principles. Living in a red state with Republican representatives doesn't mean your elections are legitimate. It doesn't mean your elections aren't rigged. It just means that when the results are reported, they tell you you've won. And in other states, they tell the other people they won. And the agenda overall just keeps marching forward. How is it that deep red states like Texas have utterly corrupt urban areas in all of the big cities? Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio. It's crazy, isn't it? These blue cities in these deep red states using the same election systems as the blue cities in the deep blue states and the same election systems as all the red parts of those deep red states. I guess we're just going to have to trust those Republicans. It could be worse. How many times do you hear people saying that? Now, I mentioned that Obama hack, David Plouffe, who ran the Center for Tech and Civic Life that received all those Zuckerbucks from the Chan Zuckerberg initiative. Now, if you didn't think that all of this was a massive coordinated info op, this is Breitbart from this morning. David Plouffe, architect of Zuckerbucks, now advising Kamala Harris. David Plouffe, who managed President Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign and advised Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's controversial Zuckerbucks effort in 2020, is now advising Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign. A report in early August noted that Harris had brought several senior Obama veterans on board, including Plouffe. Many observers noted that Harris's message improved remarkably from that point, including the emphasis on joy as a way to explain her odd laugh and as a central focus of the party at the DNC last week. Plouffe advised Zuckerberg's nonprofit organization, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, when it gave $350 million to the Safe Elections Project of the Center for Tech and Civic Life, and another $69.5 million to the Center for Election Innovation and Research. That amount rivaled total federal government spending to make elections safer during the very deadly pandemic. Analyses suggested funds were concentrated in Democrat counties in swing states. Zuckerberg had been pressured to contribute to the effort after Democrats blamed him for Donald Trump's victory in 2016, arguing that Facebook had allowed misinformation and memes by Russian troll farms to circulate on its site. Ridiculous nonsense. Now, Plouffe published a book called A Citizen's Guide to Beating Donald Trump back in 2020, and I read that book. And one of the things that really kind of caught my eye was how many votes he thought the Democrat candidate would need to beat Donald Trump based on how he thought Donald Trump would do. And he covered it in the introduction to the book. He wrote, at least 65 million Americans are almost certainly committed to voting against Trump. Growing that number by 5 to 10 million is entirely in our control. We'll do it through persuading the Obama voters who voted for Trump to come back to the light, and we'll do it by persuading younger voters in particular to stick with the Democrat nominee and not throw their critical votes to third-party candidates as symbolic gestures of rebellion and blanket denunciation. We'll do it through turnout, growing the overall number of people who walk the walk and actually cast votes. And the book sets out to create an army of purely annoying communists who do nothing but talk about elections and try to badger everyone they know into badgering everyone they know so that everybody understands it seems like everybody's voting for the communist. So the television reported in 2016 that Hillary Clinton got around 66 million votes. Plouffe believed that there were going to be 65 million people committed to voting against Donald Trump. And if they could grow that number to 70 million or 75 million, Trump would never stand a chance. And wow, they really did it. They grew it all the way to 81 million. Well beyond the bounds of what Plouffe thought he would be able to accomplish. It's amazing, isn't it, that one of the best election minds the Uniparty has to offer fell short in his best case estimations by 6 million votes, and he did his job so well that they were able to achieve 81 million real lawful American votes in the middle of the very deadliest pandemic of all time, when the candidate and his vice president couldn't attract a single soul, couldn't work their way competently through an interview or speech. They had to change election rules and regulations and processes and laws all across the country in order to, quote unquote, keep people safe from the very deadly pandemic. They had to censor the Hunter Biden laptop story. They had to censor normal Americans. They had to propagandize everyone. They had to do the summer of love to convince everyone that Republicans were racist. It just goes on and on and on. And even with all that, well over 60% of the country has not, for years, believed that Joe Biden actually won without cheating. What an amazing accomplishment for David Plouffe. It's incredible that he was able to produce those results using nearly $500 million of Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook money that he made by capturing, selling, and redeploying all of everyone's personal data so that they could be manipulated as consumers and as participants in the civil process that keeps America running, while, of course, distorting their sense of reality and destroying their relationships. A truly heroic effort. I wonder if he'll be able to do the same for the cackling idiot we're told is running for president. All right. I was hoping to maybe get to some geopolitical news, but we will save that. Maybe we'll do it tomorrow on the live stream. Tomorrow's live stream will be at 3 p.m. Eastern. So look for the blog post from Substack with the link to the interactive live stream on Rumble at some point, probably tomorrow morning. And that, of course, is for paid subscribers. So if you want to join the interactive live stream, the way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on Substack. As for this podcast, I will be back on Thursday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.